pardon my voice. I don't know if there's anything wrong with my voice, but it's like fucking 11:30 right now, and I'm already quite tired. I know I know people who usually read books to make themselves tired to get to sleep, but I'm already tired, and I gotta wake up at like fucking 6 tomorrow. But I have to read what, this much. You see this much in about a week, because I haven't been managing my time quite well. So I gotta get as much progress as I can. So I'll try to read 2 chapters today. First chapter, The Emperor's Nylon Stockings. And here's only one quote. That's good. That means I'll have to read less. Whether epistemology alone can, in strict logic, ever prove causality, even in this modern sense, may be questioned, but the same must also be said of laboratory experiments on animals. And that is by the Richard Dahl. I bet he has a real doll face, that Richard Dahl. Okay. In the early winter of 1947, government statisticians in Britain alerted the Ministry of Health that an unexpected epidemic was slowly emerging in the UK. Lung cancer morbidity had risen nearly 15-fold in the prior 2 decades. It is a matter that ought to be studied, the deputy registrar wrote. The sentence, although couched in characteristic English understatement, was strong enough to provoke a response. In February 1947, in the midst of a bitterly cold winter, the ministry asked the Medical Research Council to organize a conference of experts on the outskirts of London to study this inexplicable rise of lung cancer rates and to hunt for a cause. The conference devolved into confusion. One expert, having noted that large urban towns, where cigarette consumption was the highest, had much higher rates of lung cancer than villages, where consumption was the lowest, concluded that the only adequate explanation was the smokiness of the atmosphere. Others blamed influenza, the fog, lack of sunshine, X-rays, road tar, the common cold, and coal fires. In short, every breathable form of toxin except cigarette smoke. Befuddled by this variance in opinions, the council charged Austin Bradford Hill, the eminent biostatistician who had devised a randomized trial in the 1940s, to devise a more systematic study to identify the risk factor for lung cancer. Yet the resources committed for the study were almost comically minimal. On January 1st, 1948, the council authorized a part-time salary of £600 for a student, $350 each for 2 social workers, and £300 for incidental expenses and supplies. Hill recruited a 36-year-old medical researcher, Richard Dahl, who had never performed a study of comparable scale or significance. And that's a break, but we'll keep going. Across the Atlantic, too, the link between smoking and cancer was seemingly visible only to neophytes, young interns and residents uneducated in surgery and medicine, who seemed to make an intuitive connection between the two. In the summer of 1948, Ernst Winder, a medical student on a surgical rotation in New York, encountered an unforgettable case of a 42-year-old man who had died of bronchogenic carcinoma, cancer of the airways of the lung. The man had been a smoker, and as in most autopsies of smokers, his body had been scarred with the stigmata of chronic smoking, tar-stained bronchi, and soot-blackened lungs. The surgeon who was operating on the case made no point of it. As with most surgeons, the association had likely been invisible to him. But for Winder, who had never encountered such a case before, The image of cancer growing out of that soot-stained lung was indelible. The link was virtually staring him in the face. Vinder returned to St. Louis, where he was in medical school, and applied for money to study the association between smoking and lung cancer. He was brusquely told that the effort would be futile. He wrote to the U.S. Surgeon General, quoting prior studies that had hypothesized such an association, but was told that he would be unable to prove anything. The same correlation could be drawn to the intake of milk. No kind of interviewing can get satisfactory results from patients. Since nothing had been proved, there exists no reason why experimental work should be conducted along this line. Thwarted in his attempts to convince the Surgeon General's office, Vinder recruited an unlikely but powerful mentor in St. Louis, Evarts Graham, of nylon stockings fame. Graham didn't believe the connection between smoking and cancer either. The great pulmonary surgeon, who operated on dozens of lung cancer cases every week, was rarely seen without a cigarette himself. But he agreed to help Vinder with the study in part to conclusively disprove the link and lay the issue to rest. Graham also reasoned the trial would teach Vinder about the complexities and nuances of study design and allow him to design the trial to capture the real risk factor for lung cancer in the future. That's great. I wish there was a better position I could be in. Having to raise this book. I don't know why I'm complaining about this. Man, I just hate having to raise this book above my head for like half an hour straight. That sounds like such a first world problem. Vinder and Graham's trial followed a simple methodology. Lung cancer patients and a group of control patients without cancer were asked about their history of smoking. The ratio of smokers to non-smokers within two groups was measured to estimate whether smokers were overrepresented in lung cancer patients compared to other patients. This setup, called a case control study, was considered methodologically novel. But the trial itself was thought to be largely unimportant. When Vinder presented his preliminary ideas at the conference on lung biology in Memphis, not a single question or comment came from the members of the audience, most of whom had apparently slept through the talk or cared too little about the topic to be roused. In contrast, the presentation that followed Vinder's on an obscure disease called pulmonary adenomatosis in sheep generated a lively half-hour debate. And that was about a disease in sheep that was discussed by sheeple. Ha ha ha. Anyways, that was our second break, but we gotta move forward, right? I just choked on my own spit. Ooh. I'm fine. Like Vinder and Graham in St. Louis, Dole and Hill could also barely arouse any interest in their study in London. Hill's department, called the Statistical Unit, was housed in a narrow brick house in London's Bloomsbury district. Hefty Brunsviga calculators, the precursor of modern computers, clacked and chimed in the rooms, ringing like clocks each time a long division was performed. Epidemiologist from epidemiologists from Europe, America, and Australia thronged the statistical seminars. Just a few steps away, on the gilded railings of the London School of Tropical Medicine, the seminal epidemiological discoveries of the 19th century, the mosquito as the carrier for malaria, or the sandfly for black fever, were celebrated with plaques and inscriptions. But many epidemiologists argued that such cause-effect relationships could only be established for infectious diseases, where there was a known pathogen and a known carrier called a vector for a disease, the mosquito for malaria, or the tsetse fly for sleeping sickness. Chronic, non-infectious diseases such as cancer and diabetes were too complex and too variable to be associated with single vectors or causes, let alone preventable causes. The notion that a chronic disease such as lung cancer might have a carrier of its own sort to be gilded and hung like an epidemiological trophy on one of those balconies was dismissed as nonsense. In this charged, brooding atmosphere, Hill and Daw threw themselves into work. They were an odd couple, the younger Daw formal, dispassionate and cool, the older Hill lively, quirky, and humorous, a pukka Englishman and his puckish counterpart. The post-war economy was brittle and trudgy on the verge of a crisis. When the price of cigarettes was increased by a shilling to collect additional tax revenues, tobacco tokens were issued to those who declared themselves habitual users. During breaks in the long hours and busy days, Daw, a habitual user himself, stepped out of the building to catch a quick smoke. Daw and Hill's study was initially devised as mainly a methodological exercise. Patients with lung cancer cases versus patients admitted for other illnesses or controls were called from 20 hospitals in and around London and interviewed by a social worker in the hospital. Since even Daw believed that tobacco was unlikely to be the true culprit, the net of associations was spread widely. The survey included questions about the proximity of gasworks to patients' homes, how often they ate fried fish, and whether they preferred fried bacon, sausage, or ham for dinner. Somewhere in the haystacks of questions, Daw buried a throwaway inquiry about smoking habits. By May 1st, 1948, 156 interviews had come in, and as Daw and Hill sifted through the preliminary batch of responses, only one solid and indisputable statistical association with lung cancers leapt out: cigarette smoking. As more interviews poured in week after week, the statistical association strengthened. Even Daw, who had personally favored road tar exposure as the cause of lung cancer, could no longer argue with his own data. In the middle of the survey, sufficiently alarmed, he gave up smoking. In St. Louis, meanwhile, the Winder-Graham team had arrived at similar results. The two studies, performed on two populations across two continents, had converged on almost precisely the same magnitude of risk, a testament to the strength of the association. Daw and Hill scrambled to get their paper to a journal. In September of that year, their seminal study, Smoking and Carcinoma of the Lung, was published in the British Medical Journal. Winder and Graham had already published their study a few months earlier in the Journal of the American Medical Association. That's our third break, but, we gotta go. It is tempting to suggest that Daw, Hill, Winder, and Graham had rather effortlessly proved the link between lung cancer and smoking, but they had in fact proven something rather different. To understand that difference, and it is crucial, let us return to the methodology of the case control study. In a case control study, risk is estimated post hoc, in Daw's and Winder's case by asking patients with lung cancer whether they had smoked. In an often quoted statistical analogy, this is akin to asking car accident victims whether they had been driving under the influence of alcohol, but interviewing them after their accident. The numbers one derives from such an experiment certainly informs us about a potential link between accidents and alcohol, but it does not tell a drinker his or her actual chances of being involved in an accident. It is risk viewed as if from a rear-view mirror, risk assessed backwards, and as with any distortion, subtle biases can creep into estimations. What if drivers tend to overestimate or underestimate their intoxication at the time of an accident? Or what if, to return to Daw and Hill's case, the interviewers had unconsciously probed lung cancer victims more aggressively about their smoking habits while neglecting similar habits in the control group? Hill knew that the simplest method to counteract such biases was to invent them. If a cohort of people could be randomly assigned to two groups and one group forced to smoke cigarettes and the other forced not to smoke, then one could follow the two groups over time and determine whether lung cancer developed at an increased rate in the smoking group. That would prove causality, but such a ghoulish human experiment could not even be conceived, let alone performed on human people, without violating fundamental principles of medical ethics. But what if, recognizing the impossibility of that experiment, one could settle for the next best option, for a half-perfect experiment? Random assignment aside, the problem with Dahl and Hill's study thus far was that it had estimated risk retrospectively. But what if they could set their clocks back and launch their study before any of the subjects developed cancer? Could an epidemiologist watch a disease such as lung cancer develop from its moment of inception, much as an embryologist might observe the hatching of an egg? And that is our fourth break. But we must keep going. In the early 1940s, a similar notion had gripped the eccentric Oxford geneticist Edmund Ford. A firm believer in Darwinian evolution, Ford nonetheless knew that Darwin's theory suffered from an important limitation. Thus far, the evolutionary progression had been inferred indirectly from the fossil record, but never demonstrated directly on a population of organisms. The trouble with fossils, of course, is that they are fossilized, static and immobile in time. The existence of three fossils A, B, and C, representing three distinct and progressive stages of evolution, might suggest that fossil A generated B and fossil B generated C. But this proof is retrospective and indirect. That three evolutionary stages exist suggests but cannot prove that one fossil had caused the genesis of the next. The only formal method to prove this fact, that populations undergo defined genetic changes over time, involves capturing that change in the real world in real time, prospectively. Ford became particularly obsessed with devising such a prospective experiment to watch Darwin's cogwheels in motion. To this end, he persuaded several students to tramp through the damp marshes near Oxford collecting moths. Each time a moth was captured, it was marked with a cellulose pen and released back in the wild. Year after year, Ford's students had returned with galoshes and moth nets. What is a galosh? Recapturing and studying the moths that they had marked in the prior years and their unmarked descendants. In effect, creating a census of wild moths in the field. Minute changes in that cohort of moths, such as shifts in wing markings or variations in size, shape, and color, were recorded each year with great care. By charting these changes over nearly a decade, Ford had begun to watch evolution in action. He had documented gradual changes in the color of moth coats, and thus changes in genes, grand fluctuations in populations, and signs of natural selection by moth predators, a macrocosm caught in a marsh. Both Dahl and Hill had followed the work with deep interest, and the notion of using a similar cohort of humans occurred to Hill in the winter of 1951, purportedly, like most great scientific notions, while in his bath. Suppose a large group of men could be marked, a la Ford, with some fantastical cellulose pen, and followed decade after decade after decade. That's called stalking. Don't do that, guys. The group would contain some natural mix of smokers and non-smokers. If smoking truly disposed patients to lung cancer, much like bright-winged moths might be disposed being hunted by predators, then the smokers would begin to succumb to cancer at an increased rate. By following that cohort over time, by peering into that natural marsh of human pathology, an epidemiologist could calculate the precise relative risk of lung cancer among smokers versus non-smokers. But how might one find a large enough cohort? Again, coincidences surfaced. In Britain, efforts to nationalize healthcare had resulted in a centralized registry of all doctors, containing more than 60,000 names. Every time a doctor in the registry died, the registrar was notified, often with a relatively detailed description of the cause of death. The result, as Dahl's collaborator and student Richard Peto described it, was the creation of a fortuitous laboratory for cohort study. On October 31st, 1951, Dahl and Hill mailed out letters to about 59,600 doctors containing their survey. The questions were kept intentionally brief. Respondents were asked about their smoking habits, an estimation of the amount smoked, and little else. Most doctors could respond in less than 5 minutes. An astonishing number, 41,024 of them, wrote back. Back in London, Dahl and Hill created a master list of the doctors' cohorts, dividing it into smokers and non-smokers. Each time a death in the cohort was reported, they contacted the registrar's office to determine the precise cause of death. Deaths from lung cancer were tabulated for smokers versus non-smokers. Dahl and Hill could now sit back and watch cancer unfold in real time. In the 29 months between October 1951 and March 1954, 789 deaths were reported in Dahl and Hill's original cohort. 36 of those were attributed to lung cancer. When these lung cancer deaths were counted in smokers versus non-smokers, the correlation virtually sprang out. All 36 of the deaths had occurred in smokers. The difference between the two groups was so significant that Dahl and Hill did not even need to apply complex statistical metrics to discern it. The trial designed to bring the most rigorous statistical analysis to the cause of lung cancer barely required elementary mathematics to prove its point. So just having 36 deaths out of 789 be by smoking and lung cancer. That sounds 36 out of 789. I was a bit surprised. Like, that's not really significant, is it? Whatever the hell. Alright, that was the end of that chapter. Let's go forward, because we gotta get some good progress in. We're at page 250. I'd love to get to 300, although I really don't know if we can get there. Okay. The next chapter is called A Thief in the Night. And there are two quotes. By the way, my cancer is a squamous cell cancer, apparently like all the other smokers' lung cancers. I don't think anyone can bring up a very forcible argument against the idea of a causal connection with smoking, because after all, I had smoked for about 50 years before stopping. And that is from Evarts Graham to Ernst Winder in 1957. We believe that the products we make are not injurious to health. We always have and always will cooperate closely with those whose task it is to safeguard public health. You know, classic corporation statement. And that's from A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers, a full-page advertisement produced by the tobacco industry in 1954. Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill published a prospective study on lung cancer in 1956, the very year that the fraction of smokers in the adult American population reached its all-time peak at 45%. It had been an epochal decade for cancer epidemiology, but equally an epochal decade for tobacco. Epochal, I guess so. Wars generally stimulate two industries, ammunition and cigarettes, and indeed both the world wars had potently stimulated the already bloated tobacco industry. Cigarette sales had climbed to stratospheric heights in the mid-1940s and continued to climb in the 50s. In a gargantuan replay of 1864, as tobacco-addicted soldiers returned to civilian life, they brought even more public visibility to their addiction. To stoke its explosive growth in the post-war period, the cigarette industry poured tens and then hundreds and millions of dollars into advertising. And if advertising had transformed the tobacco industry in the past, the tobacco industry now transformed advertising. The most striking innovation of this era was the targeting of cigarette advertising to highly stratified consumers, as if to achieve exquisite specificity. In the past, cigarettes had been advertised quite generally to all consumers. By the early 1950s, though, cigarette ads and cigarette brands were being designed for segmented groups: urban workers, housewives, women, immigrants, African Americans, and to preemptively bell the medical cat, doctors themselves. Belling a cat? What the hell? More doctors smoke Camels, one advertisement reminded consumers, thus reassuring patients of the safety of their smoking. Medical journals routinely carried cigarette advertisements. At the annual conferences of the American Medical Association in the early 1950s, cigarettes were distributed free of charge to doctors who lined up outside the tobacco booths. In 1955, when Philip Morris introduced the Marlboro Man, its most successful smoking icon to date, sales of the brand shot up by a dazzling 5,000% over 8 months. Marlboro promised a nearly erotic celebration of tobacco and machismo rolled into a single seductive pack. Man-sized taste of honest tobacco comes full through. Smooth drawing filter feels right in your mouth. Works fine but doesn't get in the way. By the early 1960s, the gross annual sale of cigarettes in America peaked at nearly $5 billion, a number unparalleled in the history of tobacco. On average, Americans were consuming nearly 4,000 cigarettes per year, or about 11 cigarettes per day, nearly once for every waking hour. That is our first break, but let's keep going. Public health organizations in America in the mid-1950s were largely unperturbed by the link between tobacco and cancer delineated by the Dahl and Hill studies. Initially, few, if any, organizations highlighted this study as an integral part of an anti-cancer campaign, although this would soon change. But the tobacco industry was far from complacent. Concerned that the ever-tightening link between tar, tobacco, and cancer would eventually begin to frighten consumers away, cigarette makers began to proactively tout the benefits of filters added to the tips of their cigarettes as a safety measure. On December 28, 1953, 3 years before Dahl's prospective study had been released to the public, the heads of several tobacco companies met preemptively at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Bad publicity was clearly looming on the horizon. To counteract the scientific attack, an equal and opposite counterattack was needed. The centerpiece of that counterattack was an advertisement titled A Frank Statement, which saturated the news media in 1954, appearing simultaneously in more than 400 newspapers over a few weeks. Written as an open letter from tobacco makers to the public, the statement's purpose was to address the fears and rumors about the possible link between lung cancer and tobacco. In about 600 words, it would nearly rewrite the research on tobacco and cancer. A frank statement was anything but frank. The speciousness began right from its opening lines. Recent reports on experiments with mice have given wide publicity to a theory that cigarette smoking is in some way linked with lung cancer in human beings. Nothing, in fact, could have been further from the truth. The most damaging of the recent experiments, and certainly the ones that had received the widest publicity, were the Dahl-Hill and Wundergraham retrospective studies, both of which had been performed not on mice but on humans. By making the science seem obscure and arcane, these sentences sought to render its results equally arcane. Evolutionary distance would also force emotional distance. After all, who could possibly care about lung cancer in mice? Obfuscation of facts, though, was only the first line of defense. The more ingenious form of manipulation was to gnaw at science's own self-doubt. The statistics purporting to link cigarette smoking with the disease could apply with equal force to any of the other aspects of modern life. Indeed, the validity of the statistics themselves is questioned by numerous scientists. By half revealing and half concealing the actual disagreements among scientists, the advertisement performed a complex dance of veils. What precisely was being questioned by numerous scientists, or what link was being claimed between lung cancer and other features of modern life, was left entirely to the reader's imagination. Obfuscation of facts and reflection of self-doubt, the proverbial combination of smoke and mirrors, might have sufficed for any ordinary public relations campaign, but the final ploy was unrivaled in its genius. Rather than discourage further research into the link between tobacco and cancer, tobacco companies propose letting scientists have more of it. We are pledging aid and assistance to the research effort into all phases of tobacco uses and health, in addition to what is already being contributed by individual companies. The implication was that if more research was needed, then the issue was still mired in doubt and thus unresolved. Let the public have its addiction, and let the researchers have theirs. To bring this three-pronged strategy to fruition, the tobacco lobby had already formed a research committee, which it called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, or the TIRC. Ostensibly, the TIRC would act as an intermediary between an increasingly hostile academy, an increasingly embattled tobacco industry, and an increasingly confused public. In January 1954, after a protracted search, the TIRC announced that it had finally chosen a director, who had, as the Institute never failed to remind the public, been ushered in from the deepest realms of science. Their choice, as if to close the circles of irony, was Clarence Cook Little, the ambitious contrarian that the Lascarites had once deposed as president of the American Society for the Control of Cancer. That's very, very ironic. Yes. That's another break, but we have to keep going. If Clarence Little had not been discovered by the tobacco lobbyists in 1954, then they might have needed to invent him. He came preformed to their precise specifications. Opinionated, forceful, and voluble, Little was a geneticist by training. He had set up a vast animal research laboratory at Bar Harbor in Maine, which served as a repository for purebred strains of mice for medical experiments. Purity and genetics were Little's preoccupations. He was a strong proponent of the theory that all diseases, including cancer, was essentially hereditary, and that these illnesses, in the form of a medical ethnic cleansing, would eventually carry away those with such predispositions, leaving a genetically enriched population resistant to diseases. That's just eugenics. This notion, called eugenics light, he knows as well, was equally applied to lung cancer, which he also considered principally the product of a genetic aberration. Smoking, Little argued, merely unveiled that inherent aberration, causing that bad germ to emerge and unfold in a human body. Blaming cigarettes for lung cancer, then, was like blaming umbrellas for bringing out the rain. The TIRC and the tobacco lobby vociferously embraced that view. Dahl and Hill, and Vinder and Graham had certainly correlated smoking and lung cancer, but a correlation, Little insisted, could not be equated with cause. In a guest editorial written for the journal Cancer Research in 1956, Little argued that if the tobacco industry was being blamed for scientific dishonesty, then anti-tobacco activists bore the blame for scientific disingenuousness. How could scientists so easily conflate a mere confluence of two events, smoking and lung cancer, with a causal relationship? Graham, who knew Little from his days at the ASCC, was livid. In a stinging rebuttal written to the editor, he complained, "A causal relationship between heavy cigarette smoking and cancer of the lung is stronger than for the efficacy of vaccination against smallpox, which is only statistical. Indeed, like many of his epidemiologist peers, Graham was being exasperated by the with the exaggerated scrutiny of the word cause. That word, he believed, had outlived its original utility and turned into a liability. In 1884, the microbiologist Richard Koch had stipulated that for an agent to be defined as the cause of a disease, it would need to fulfill at least three criteria. The causal agent had to be present in diseased animals, it had to be isolated from diseased animals, and had to be capable of transmitting the disease when introduced into a secondary host. But Koch's postulates had arisen crucially from the study of infectious diseases and infectious agents. They could not simply be repurposed for many non-infectious diseases. In lung cancer, for instance, it would be absurd to imagine a carcinogen being isolated from a cancerous lung after months or years of the original exposure. Transmission studies in mice were bound to be equally frustrating. As Bradford Hill argued, we may subject mice or other laboratory animals to such an atmosphere of tobacco smoke that they can, like the old man in the fairy story, neither sleep nor slumber. They can neither breathe nor eat, and lung cancer may or may not develop to a significant degree. What then? Indeed, what then? With Vinder and other co-workers, Graham had tried to expose mice to a toxic atmosphere of tobacco smoke, or at least its closest conceivable equivalent. Persuading mice to chain smoke was obviously unlikely to succeed. So, in an inspired experiment performed in his lab in St. Louis, Graham had invented a smoking machine, a contraption that would puff the equivalent of hundreds of cigarettes all day, and deposit the tarry black residue through a maze of suction chambers into a distilling flask of acetone. By serially painting the tar on the skins of mice, Graham and Vinder had found they could create tumors on the backs of mice. But these studies had, if anything, fanned up even more controversy. Forbes magazine had famously spoofed the research by asking Graham how many men distilled their tar from their tobacco and painted it on their backs, and critics such as Little might as well have complained that this experiment was akin to distilling an orange in a millionth of a million parts, and then inferring madly that the original fruit was too poisonous to eat. Epidemiology, like the old man in Hill's fairy story, was thus itself huffing against the stifling economy of Koch's postulates. The classical triad, association, isolation, retransmission, would simply not suffice. What preventive medicine needed was its own understanding of cause. Once again, Bradford Hill, the eminence grise of epidemiology, proposed a solution to this impasse. For studies on chronic and complex human diseases such as cancer, Hill suggested, the traditional understanding of causality needed to be broadened and revised. If lung cancer could not fit in the Koch straitjacket, then the jacket needed to be loosened. Hill acknowledged epidemiology's infernal methodological struggle with causation. This was not an experimental discipline at its core, but he rose beyond it. At least in the case of lung cancer and smoking, he argued, the association possessed several additional features. Number one, it was strong. The increased risk of cancer was nearly 5 or 10-fold in smokers. It was consistent. Dahl and Hill's study and Vinder and Graham's study performed in vastly different contexts on vastly different populations, and they had both come up with the same link. It was specific, that's number 3. Tobacco is linked to lung cancer, precisely the site where tobacco smoke enters the body. Number 4, it was temporal. Dahl and Hill had found that the longer one smoked, the greater the increase in risk. Number 5, it possessed a biological gradient. The more one smoked in quantity, the greater the risk for lung cancer. Number 6, it was plausible. A mechanistic link between an inhaled carcinogen and a malignant change in the lung was not implausible. And number, what was it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it was coherent. It was backed by experimental evidence. The epidemiological findings and the laboratory findings, such as Graham's tar painting experiments in mice, were concordant, or they agreed with each other. Number 8, it behaved similarly in analogous situations. Smoking had been correlated with lung cancer, and also with lip, throat, tongue, and esophageal cancer. Hill used these criteria to advance a radical proposition. Epidemiologists, he argued, could infer causality by using that list of 9 criteria. No single item in that list proved a causal relationship. Rather, Hill's list functioned as a sort of a la carte menu from which scientists could pick and choose criteria to strengthen or weaken the notion of a causal relationship. For scientific purists, this seemed rococo, and like all things rococo, all too easy to mock. Imagine a mathematician or a physicist choosing from a menu of 9 criteria to infer causality. Yet Hill's list would charge epidemiological research with pragmatic clarity. Rather than fussing about the metaphysical idea about causality, Hill changed its emphasis to a functional or operational idea. Cause is what cause does, Hill claimed. Often, like the weight of a proof in a detective case, the preponderance of small bits of evidence, rather than a single definitive experiment, clinched cause. And that's the second to last break. We're almost there. Amid this charged and historic reorganization of epidemiology in the winter of 1956, Evarts Graham suddenly fell ill with what he thought was the flu. He was at the pinnacle of his career, a surgeon in full. His legacy was far-reaching. He had revolutionized lung cancer surgery by stitching together surgical procedures learned from 19th century TB wards. He had investigated mechanisms by which cancer cells arose, using tobacco as his chosen carcinogen. And with Vinder, he had firmly established the epidemiological link between cigarettes and lung cancer. In the end, though, it was his prior aversion to the theory that he himself had proved that undid Evarts Graham. In January 1957, when the flu refused to remit, Graham underwent a battery of tests at Barnes Hospital. An X-ray revealed the cause of his troubles, a large coarse rind of a tumor clogging the upper bronchioles and both lungs, riddled with hundreds of metastatic deposits of cancer. Keeping the identity of the patient hidden, Graham showed his films to his surgical colleagues. The surgeon looked at the X-rays and deemed the tumor inoperable and hopeless. Graham then informed him quietly, "The tumor is mine." On February 14th, that's Valentine's Day. On Valentine's Day, with his condition deteriorating weekly, Graham wrote to his friend and collaborator, the surgeon Alton Ochsner. "Perhaps you have heard that I have recently been a patient at Barnes Hospital because of bilateral bronchogenic carcinoma, which sneaked up on me like a thief in the night. You know I quit smoking more than 5 years ago, but the trouble is that I smoked for 50 years. 2 weeks later, Graham grew dizzy, nauseated, and confused while shaving. That's kind of the worst time to get dizzy and nauseated, when you have a fucking razor on your fucking face. Never mind. He was brought to Barnes again, to a room a few floors above the operating room so beloved by him. He was given intravenous chemotherapy with nitrogen mustard, but to no avail. The thief had widely marauded. Cancer was growing in his lungs, lymph nodes, adrenal glands, liver, and brain. On February 26th, confused, lethargic, and incoherent, he drifted into a coma and died in his room. He was 74 years old. By his request, his body was donated to the Department of Anatomy as an autopsy specimen for other students. In the winter of 1954, 3 years before his untimely death, Evarts Graham wrote a strikingly prescient essay in a book entitled Smoking and Cancer. At the end of the essay, Graham wondered about how the spread of tobacco in human societies might be combated in the future. Medicine, he concluded, was not powerful enough to restrict tobacco's spread. Academic investigators could provide data about risks and argue incessantly about proof and causality, but the solution had to be political. The obstinacy of policymakers, he wrote, compels one to conclude that it is their own addiction which blinds them. They have eyes to see, but see not because of their inability or unwillingness to give up smoking. All of this leads to the question, are the radio and the television to be permitted to continue carrying the advertising material of the cigarette industry? Isn't it time that the official guardian of the people's health, the U.S. Public Health Service, at least make a statement of warning? This author has a way of naming titles, because the next chapter is quite literally called a statement of warning, and it is, what the fuck, it's like 20 pages long. Oh, I can't do this. I will have to stop. But we did stuff. We got from we read like fucking 20 pages. That's not really enough. But this weekend, I'll fucking lock in. Maybe tomorrow I'll lock in as well, alright? But I have to wake up at 6 tomorrow, so I will stop here.